I used to think life was simple, that the people who said they cared actually did. That loyalty wasn't just a word you threw around to make yourself feel good. I believed in the faces I saw every day, in the words that sounded like promises, in the warmth that felt like home. My life, at least on the surface, was ordinary, filled with laughter, late-night conversations, and a sense of security I never questioned. I thought I was surrounded by people who would never let me fall. There was my best friend, always there when I needed them, always ready with a joke or a shoulder. But even then, something would flicker in their eyes sometimes, a hesitation, a glance that lingered too long before looking away. I didn't think much of it. I convinced myself it was nothing, because to acknowledge it would have meant admitting that maybe, just maybe, people weren't as solid as they seemed. And then there was her, the one I let in more than anyone. Charming, thoughtful, someone who seemed to understand the way my heart worked without me ever speaking a word. I trusted her in a way I hadn't trusted anyone. I believed in the little things she did, the way her attention made me feel like I was the only person in the room. Every smile felt like a guarantee, every touch like an unspoken vow. I clung to that trust because it was the only thing that made sense to me. But life has a way of whispering truths you don't want to hear. Subtle cracks began to appear, small enough that I could almost ignore them. A missed call, a hidden message, a laugh that didn't reach her eyes. At first, I dismissed it. I told myself I was overthinking, that my insecurities were creating shadows where none existed. But shadows don't always lie. Sometimes, they're the first warning you've been waiting for. And in those quiet moments, when I was alone with my thoughts, when the laughter faded, and the rooms felt emptier than they should, I felt it. The sense that someone I held closest, someone I let define my comfort and my belief in people, might not be entirely real. The thought alone was suffocating. My life, the one I had trusted so completely, was starting to feel fragile, like a glass sculpture perched on the edge of a table. One wrong move, and everything could shatter. I never wanted to see it. I didn't want to face the idea that my instincts, my gut, might be right. But even in my denial, the unease grew. I could feel it in the way mornings arrived heavier than they should, in the way smiles felt a little forced, in the quiet spaces between words that once felt like music. And that's when the first true understanding began. Trust is not a gift you give freely, it's a risk you take, and sometimes the people you love the most will test how far you're willing to go before the world you built starts to crack. I had no idea then how deep those cracks would run. I only knew that life as I had trusted it was starting to feel like a stranger in my own home. And the truth I refused to see was waiting, quietly, to change everything. I used to believe that trust was a shield, something that protected you from the sharp edges of life. But that belief, it started to crumble the moment the first cracks appeared. At first, they were almost invisible, like tiny fissures in a wall you've always assumed to be solid. A glance that lingered too long, a comment that felt slightly off, a promise that quietly slipped away. I told myself it was nothing, that I was overreacting. I clung to loyalty like a life raft, because admitting doubt felt like betrayal in itself. Then there were the subtle betrayals, the ones you don't want to acknowledge because they make your world feel unsafe. My sibling, someone I had loved without question, started saying things that planted seeds of doubt. A carefully worded comment here, a hidden criticism there, enough to make me question myself. But I ignored it. I told myself they meant well, that I was imagining things, that family didn't intentionally hurt you. And yet, every word, every slight smile that didn't reach their eyes, lingered longer than it should have. And she wasn't entirely herself either. I noticed the small inconsistencies, the stories that didn't quite line up, the way her attention shifted subtly when certain people were around. But I wanted to believe. I wanted to cling to the version of her I had trusted, the version that made my life feel stable, the version that made me feel safe. So I ignored the whispers of doubt, pushing them to the corners of my mind where they couldn't speak too loudly. Advice came from unexpected places. A colleague, someone I barely considered close, tried to open my eyes. Their words were gentle but persistent, a soft warning amid the noise I refused to hear. They spoke about patterns, about manipulation, about noticing the signs before it's too late. I nodded politely, thanked them, and returned to my own world, stubborn in my loyalty, unwilling to see the cracks forming beneath my feet. But life has a way of forcing your gaze. Misunderstandings piled on top of each other, small lies layered like sediment, until the foundation I had trusted so completely began to wobble. I found myself replaying conversations, reading between lines I had once ignored. I questioned my judgment. I questioned my ability to trust even myself. And the more I questioned, the heavier the weight grew, pressing down on me in ways I had never imagined. I felt powerless. I wanted to act, to confront, to demand clarity, but every move felt like stepping on ice. One wrong word, one misstep, and I feared it would all collapse, shattering not just my relationships, but the sense of self I had built around them. And yet, I couldn't simply walk away, not yet. My heart clung to the fragments of faith I had left, even as the shadows of doubt stretched longer, darker, around every corner of my life. The tension was unbearable, a slow burn that consumed the edges of my reality. I began to understand that life wasn't the simple story I had believed. People were layered, motives were hidden, and loyalty wasn't always reciprocated. And in that realization, I felt something I hadn't expected. Fear, yes, but also a strange clarity. Life had cracks, and those cracks weren't going to disappear because I wished them away. They demanded acknowledgement, confrontation, and ultimately, understanding. And so I waited, teetering between what I wanted to believe and what I could no longer ignore, feeling the first true tremors of a life that would soon demand more than I was prepared to give. The world I trusted was no longer entirely mine, and I was beginning to see the cost of holding on too tightly. I didn't see it coming. Not really. I had learned to notice the whispers, the small signs, the tiny cracks, but I convinced myself that the people I loved wouldn't ever cross the lines that mattered. I was naive, stubborn, loyal to a fault, and that loyalty became my weakness. The betrayal hit me like a storm tearing through a house I thought was unshakable. It was someone I had let in completely, someone whose presence had always felt like safety. I had trusted them with my fears, my dreams, my quiet moments no one else knew existed. And then, in a single, unimaginable moment, they did the one thing that erased all of that trust, that made everything I believed in collapse. The world didn't just stop, it crumbled beneath me. Every laugh, every conversation, every glance I had shared felt like a lie I had chosen to believe. I remember standing there, frozen, watching the evidence of their betrayal unfold. Shock rooted me to the spot. Disbelief twisted my stomach into knots. How could someone I held so close, someone I had allowed to shape my world, do this? The anger didn't come first. At first, it was just emptiness, a hollow, weightless void where trust used to live. And then came the heartbreak, the kind that makes your chest ache like it's breaking in real time. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. I wanted to confront them and demand answers, but my voice was gone, my words trapped behind the walls of betrayal. The truth of it was unbearable, but it also forced clarity. I saw them for who they were, not the version I had adored, not the mask they wore so convincingly, but the reality beneath it. And in that clarity came a terrible realization. Some people aren't meant to stay in your life, no matter how much you love them, no matter how much you believed. And holding on only destroys the part of yourself that still has hope. I turned to someone I had always admired, a mentor, an elder figure who had watched me stumble and rise in quiet ways. Their eyes held the weight of experience, the understanding of someone who had seen the world fracture before. They didn't tell me what to do. They didn't offer simple solutions or words to erase the pain. They just let me feel it, and then they reminded me that my strength wasn't in fighting for someone who didn't deserve it. It was in protecting the part of myself that still believed in goodness, even when others failed. I realized then that walking away wasn't cowardice. It wasn't giving up. It was the hardest choice I had ever faced, but it was necessary. I had to leave silently because confrontation would only give the betrayer power over my pain. Silence became my armor, my way of preserving what was left of me. The decision wasn't made in anger, or revenge, or pride. It was made in survival, in understanding that some bonds are too dangerous to hold on to. Every step away from them felt like a loss, but also like reclamation. I carried the heartbreak, yes, but also a strange, painful kind of freedom. The life I had known, the people I had trusted, the illusions I had built, they were gone. And in their place, something raw and real began to grow. I didn't know who I would become yet, but I knew I could no longer be naive. I could no longer let the world dictate my worth. Walking away silently didn't erase the betrayal, but it gave me control over what I would let it take from me. And for the first time since the cracks appeared, I felt the faint pulse of power returning, the quiet, unshakable knowledge that even in heartbreak, I would survive. I would rebuild. And one day, I would see clearly who deserved my trust and who didn't. I walked away without a word. No explanations, no goodbyes, no pleading or attempts to justify what I couldn't even begin to explain to myself. I left behind the people I had trusted, the walls I had built, the version of life I had thought was mine. For the first time in years, I was truly alone. And the silence was deafening. At first, it felt like freedom. Every step I took away from them was a step away from pain, away from betrayal, away from the weight of a life that had started to suffocate me. But freedom has a cost. Loneliness seeped into my bones, an ache that no distraction could mask. Every empty room, every quiet street, every passing stranger reminded me that I had abandoned more than just toxic connections. I had abandoned the familiar, the predictable, the people who had shaped the rhythm of my days. Guilt came next, slow and insistent, clawing at the edges of my mind. I wondered if I had been cruel, selfish, or weak. Did I leave too soon? Did I destroy something that could have been fixed? Questions circled endlessly, each one sharper than the last. I carried the memories with me, little fragments that wouldn't fade, shared laughter, whispered secrets, moments that had once felt infinite. They haunted me, not as punishment, but as proof of what I had lost. And yet, there was relief, too, a quiet, undeniable relief that I hadn't allowed myself to feel before. Relief that I no longer had to navigate a world of half-truths and hidden agendas, that I didn't have to fight for validation from people who couldn't honor trust. Relief that the chains of expectation and obligation were gone, replaced by an empty canvas where I could finally breathe. The journey was not simple. I met someone along the way, a stranger whose presence didn't demand anything from me. They weren't a replacement, and I wasn't ready to let anyone in, but they represented something fragile and real, a hint that growth was possible even amidst destruction. Our conversations were brief, our paths only occasionally crossing, but their quiet understanding reminded me that life outside my old world was not entirely cold. There was potential here, something I hadn't allowed myself to imagine before. But the past has a way of following you. Someone from my former life appeared unexpectedly, demanding answers, trying to pull me back into the chaos I had left behind. Their words were sharp, their motives clear. They wanted me to return, to confront, to reinsert myself into a world I had deliberately abandoned. I felt the old pull, the temptation to explain, to justify, to apologize. But I knew it would only undo what I had fought so hard to reclaim. So I refused, silently, with nothing but my own resolve as armor. The internal battle was relentless. Each day I wondered if I had made the right choice, if I had abandoned too much, if I had been too harsh. But deep down, beneath the guilt, beneath the loneliness, I sensed the truth. I had acted for myself, and for the first time, that alone mattered. Walking away wasn't cowardice, it was survival. And survival, I was learning, often comes with pain, with doubt, and with the strange, unsteady liberation of choosing yourself when the world seems determined to define you by others. I didn't have answers yet. I didn't even fully understand the person I was becoming. But I knew one thing with clarity: the silence I carried wasn't empty. It was mine. And in that silence, for the first time in a long time, I could hear the faintest heartbeat of who I was meant to be. The years were slow, but relentless. Each day felt like a tiny victory, a quiet affirmation that I could endure, that I could survive. I wasn't the same person who had walked away in silence. That version of me, the one tied to trust and betrayal, the one who believed loyalty could protect me, was buried somewhere beneath layers of pain and solitude. What remained was raw, unpolished, and real, a self I had to rebuild from scratch. At first, rebuilding felt impossible. I didn't know who I was without the people who had defined my world. I had to relearn my own heart, understand the rhythms of my own thoughts, and confront the truths I had avoided for years. Every memory of betrayal, every shadow of guilt and doubt, became a lesson I couldn't ignore. Slowly, I started to focus on myself, not in arrogance, not in selfishness, but in the quiet necessity of survival. I had to grow roots that weren't dependent on anyone else, strong enough to hold me even if the world turned against me. Along the way, I met people who didn't demand my trust but offered perspective. One mentor, a guide of sorts, saw the potential in my shattered self and nudged me gently toward growth. They didn't fix me. They didn't tell me who to be. But their presence reminded me that resilience isn't built in isolation. It's built through guidance, through challenge, through the subtle encouragement of someone who believes in your ability to rise even when you've forgotten your own strength. I learned to value knowledge, to seek understanding, to challenge myself. Every skill I developed, every lesson I absorbed, was a piece of armor, a stepping stone, a small triumph over the version of life that had once held me hostage. I started to see my pain not as a wound, but as a teacher, shaping my instincts, my decisions, my capacity to endure. The heartbreak, the loneliness, the betrayal, they all became part of the foundation on which I could build a life that was mine, unshaken by the past. And then, unexpectedly, I noticed a new presence in my life, a hint of connection I hadn't felt in years. Not the intensity of the love I had once lost, but a subtle warmth that suggested possibility. There were moments that made me hesitate, moments that reminded me of how far I had come and how careful I had to be. But I allowed myself to notice, to feel, without expectation or fear of repeating old mistakes. It wasn't about replacing what I had lost. It was about opening a door I had long kept closed. I realized that rebuilding wasn't a single moment of triumph. It was a series of choices, small yet deliberate, to honor my own growth. It was laughing again, even when it felt unfamiliar. It was trusting slowly, cautiously, learning to recognize authenticity. It was saying no to the patterns that had once trapped me, and saying yes to challenges that forced me to stretch beyond what I thought possible. By the end of each day, I felt the subtle pulse of transformation. I was stronger, yes, but more importantly, I was aware of my own power, my own worth. I had rebuilt not just a life, but a self that could navigate the world with clarity, with resilience, with the quiet certainty that no betrayal, no shadow of the past, could define me again. I didn't yet know where this new path would lead, or who I might meet along the way, but I felt something I hadn't felt in years, the unmistakable, steady rhythm of hope. And for the first time since the cracks had begun, hope felt real. Sometimes, the past comes back not with a bang, but as a quiet echo. It doesn't announce itself with drama. It creeps in through memory, through the familiar scent of a street, a song, a phrase that suddenly feels heavy with meaning. I find myself thinking of them, the people I left behind, the lives I walked away from, and the weight of it hits me in ways I didn't expect. Not with anger, not even with longing, but with clarity. I remember my former friend, the one I trusted so completely. Seeing their face in my mind now, I feel a strange mixture of guilt and understanding. I remember laughter that once felt infinite, conversations that carried the weight of promises we weren't ready to keep. And yet, beneath it all, I see the cracks I refuse to acknowledge, the subtle betrayals, the choices that left me exposed, the moments when loyalty wasn't reciprocated. I left to protect myself, but even knowing that, a part of me aches for the life I abandoned. The minor figures of the past, the people who tried to manipulate or control me in small ways, still cast shadows over my thoughts. Their influence lingers, like a storm cloud that refuses to disappear entirely. Sometimes it feels unfair, that even years later, the echoes of their actions can tug at me, but I have to remind myself that these shadows exist only because I once allowed them space in my life. Reflection isn't about blame. It's about understanding, about seeing the full picture without distortion or denial. I think of the moments I missed, the opportunities that slipped through my fingers because I was too loyal, too trusting, too naive. There's pain in those memories, yes, but also a kind of revelation. I begin to understand my own patterns, the ways I gave pieces of myself away too easily, the ways I ignored instinct for comfort. And in that understanding, I find a strange peace. Growth isn't about forgetting the past, it's about seeing it clearly and learning from it, about taking the lessons and carrying them forward without being weighed down. Reflection also brings gratitude. Gratitude for the pain that forced me to evolve, for the betrayals that taught me discernment, for the silence that allowed me to hear myself for the first time. I start to see that every fractured relationship, every moment of heartbreak, has shaped me into someone who can navigate life with more awareness, more resilience, and more depth than I ever imagined. The nostalgia is bittersweet, but it's tempered by the knowledge that I survived it, and that survival itself is a form of strength. I think about how far I've come, the distance between the person I was when I walked away and the person I am now. There's humility in that realization, but also quiet pride. I no longer need the validation of those who hurt me. I no longer fear the shadows of the past. I see them, acknowledge them, but they don't define me. And in that acknowledgement, I feel something rare and profound: clarity. The past doesn't vanish, and it shouldn't. It exists to remind me, to guide me, to illuminate the choices that brought me here. I can feel the echoes of those I left behind, but I also feel the strength to move forward, carrying their lessons lightly, letting them inform me without imprisoning me. Reflection isn't dwelling, it's understanding, and in that understanding, I finally see the contours of my own heart with honesty, depth, and quiet certainty. They came back when I wasn't looking for them, when life had already begun to settle into a rhythm that felt mine. At first, I didn't recognize the weight of their presence. Faces I had buried in memory, voices I had tried to silence, they appeared at the edge of my world, tentative, hesitant, as if they were testing whether I still belonged to the person I had been before. My past romantic interest stood there first, eyes wide with something that looked like regret. The charm that had once captivated me was gone, replaced by a vulnerability I hadn't seen before. I could feel the unspoken words behind their gaze, the desire for an apology, for recognition, for some kind of absolution. But I had changed. I wasn't the same person who had opened their heart blindly. I didn't need their validation, and I wasn't willing to let their remorse erase the lessons I had learned through pain. Then my old best friend, or sibling, depending on which role they chose to play that day, stepped forward. Their presence carried expectation, entitlement, and a subtle accusation. They wanted answers, closure, explanations for the silence I had maintained for so long. I felt the old ache, the tension that had once bound us together, but it didn't pull me in the same way. My boundaries had been redrawn through years of reflection and survival. I was no longer vulnerable to their emotional manipulation. They spoke, their words careful, rehearsed, trying to rebuild a bridge that had long since collapsed. They wanted me to feel the weight of guilt, to acknowledge the pain I had carried silently. But I listened without giving in, without letting the old bonds dictate my response. I realized then that reconciliation is not an obligation, it is a choice. And I could choose my peace over their discomfort. I saw the shock in their faces as they realized I wasn't the same person they had once known. The naive trust, the loyalty that could be exploited, they were gone. What remained was clarity, strength, and an unwavering sense of self. I didn't speak to punish, and I didn't need to. My presence alone, calm and unshaken, was enough to convey the distance I had traveled. There was a strange justice in their surprise. Life had a way of balancing itself, subtle and quiet, not with grand gestures but with the undeniable truth that actions have consequences. They had once assumed my silence was weakness, my trust was endless. Now, my evolved self stood before them as a quiet testament to endurance, to boundaries, to survival. I didn't seek closure, because closure is not always for others, it is for yourself. My confrontation wasn't loud or dramatic. It was simply me existing fully, without apology, without compromise. And in that existence, I felt a strange release, a validation not from them but from myself. The past had returned, hoping to unsettle me, but it found only a version of me too strong, too aware, and too grounded to be shaken. Walking away from them once again, I felt no guilt, no hesitation, only the quiet satisfaction of knowing that growth cannot be bargained with, cannot be undone, and cannot be stolen back. I had become someone they could no longer influence, and in that, I discovered a profound truth. The only reconciliation that truly matters is the one you make with yourself. They finally understood. Not because I told them, not because I explained or justified, but because the silence I had carried for so long spoke louder than any words could. The people who had once held my trust, and then shattered it, looked at me now with the dawning awareness of their mistakes. Their eyes searched for answers, for the reason I had walked away, and in that moment, I realized that explanation was no longer necessary. The reason had always been clear. It was me choosing myself over a world that had failed to honor me. I watched them grapple with their own guilt, their regret, the recognition of what they had lost. Some looked ashamed, some hesitant, unsure of whether to reach out. But I didn't need them to act, to apologize, or to make amends. I had already made peace with what had happened. My strength, my growth, had come not from their recognition, but from my own willingness to survive, to rebuild, and to rise from the pieces they had left behind. Forgiveness, I realized, was not an obligation. It wasn't a gift I owed them. It was a choice I could make, not for them, but for myself. I could forgive, yes, but not in a way that erased their actions or diminished the lessons I had learned. I could remain distant, preserving the boundaries that kept me safe. Or I could simply move forward, letting the past exist as it was, immutable, unchangeable, yet powerless to define the person I had become. And in that choice, I found freedom. The people who had once seemed so central to my life were now figures in the background, echoes of moments that had shaped me but no longer controlled me. I could see them clearly for the first time, not through the haze of hurt and hope, but with the clarity of someone who had walked through fire and emerged whole. Their faces, their apologies, their attempts at reconciliation, they mattered less than I had feared, because I had already claimed my own power. I felt a subtle, profound shift inside me, the quiet affirmation that I had grown stronger than my circumstances, wiser than my pain, and more resilient than any betrayal. The heartbreak, the silence, the solitude, all of it had been a crucible, and I had emerged tempered, aware, and unshakable. I no longer feared loss, because I had learned that what matters most cannot be taken from you. It lives within, in the strength of your choices, in the clarity of your understanding, and in the courage to continue when the world tries to pull you back. As I walked away from the past, from the people, from the echoes of what had once defined my life, I felt a strange serenity. It wasn't happiness in the naive sense, and it wasn't relief that everything had been fixed. It was something deeper, a cinematic, almost tangible understanding of my own journey. Life had tested me, betrayed me, and reshaped me, and now I was complete, not because others had changed, but because I had. I was no longer the person who clung to trust blindly, who let betrayal define my heart. I was someone who had learned the weight of loyalty, the cost of deception, and the unshakable power of self-respect. And in that realization, I found closure, not in what they had done, not in their apologies, but in the undeniable truth of who I had become. I looked ahead, at the life that stretched beyond the remnants of the past, and for the first time, I felt a sense of quiet, enduring possibility. The past was a part of me, yes, but it no longer dictated the rhythm of my days. I had chosen myself, and in that choice, I had discovered the most powerful truth of all. The new me was free, whole, and finally unafraid.